Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being with us in this webinar organized by the Division for Inclusive Social Development in the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, or DESA. I'm John Wilmoth, Acting Director of the Division for Inclusive Social Development and the Director of the Population Division, both within DESA. Today, we have the honor and the pleasure of hearing from Professor Daron Acemoglu, whose work has profoundly influenced our understanding of economics and development. His talk today, entitled, "Can We Have Pro-Human AI?" is based on findings from his new book, Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity, co-authored with Simon Johnson. Power and Progress tackles a timely and very important topic, namely the relationship between technological advance, human progress, and how our choices shape the path of technological change. Professor Acemoglu's work sheds light on an undeniable fact, which is that the impacts of technological change, including AI, are socially and institutionally determined. Technology has been used as a tool for democratization, but it can also be used for division. Technology can reduce or widen social and economic inequalities, and it can foster or undermine decent work. Where the needle falls along the spectrum is up to us. Can AI empower and complement rather than replace human capabilities? Is AI increasing workers' productivity? And if and where that is true, are workers themselves enjoying or at least sharing in the benefits? The answers to these questions are socially constructed. Professor Acemoglu's latest work provides crucial insights into questions such as these and helps to enlighten the choices, be they institutional, social, or political, that are needed to turn technological progress and innovation into powerful tools for equitable and inclusive sustainable development. Professor Acemoglu himself needs little introduction. He is an economist and professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT. He is also, as we all know, a prolific author who, before Power and Progress, gave us many influential works, including the books Why Nations Fail and The Narrow Corridor, as well as hundreds of research papers. His research has been recognized with numerous awards and honors, and his ideas continue to shape the discourse in economics and beyond. Towards the end of this webinar, we will have some time to invite Professor Acemoglu to answer your questions. So please post them in the Q&A box only, not in the chat, in the Q&A box. And you can do that at any point during the webinar. And now, without further ado, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. It's a true pleasure to be able to join this webinar. That was a wonderful introduction that really gets to the heart of a lot of what I want to say. So I'm going to be repeating a few of the things that you said, John. And let me first say that I'm going to draw heavily from my book with Simon Johnson, as well as research I have done with several collaborators. But today, I want to put the focus on a few of the aspects that I think are in the minds of many people, in particular about the effects of new digital technologies, especially AI. With advances in generative AI, we have potentially entered a new world in which we are very much at the beginning of a process of change. And many people are concerned about where that change is going to go. And I think they are right to be concerned. And the broader question is really what determines the direction of that research and who will benefit, who will lose. And part of the emphasis of the book with Simon, and my emphasis here, is that there are more pro-human versus less pro-human directions of this. But here I'm going to especially talk about the worker side. Part of the reason is to keep it a little bit more focused. In the book, we talk a lot about the democracy aspect. I'll touch on that a little bit as well, but I thought in the interest of brevity, I'll put the democracy issues a little bit towards the end. And the worker emphasis here is very important, because most of us earn and will continue to earn our living in the labor market. So what these new technologies do to wages, to workers, to working conditions are going to be crucial about who benefits and who loses. I think the promise of AI needs to be clarified, partly because there's a lot of hype out there, so it's sometimes difficult to separate the hype from reality. But it is my view that indeed there is a potential promise of new generative AI tools, which are in some ways quite impressive, in other ways flawed, but in some ways quite impressive. And I think the real promise, which is sometimes mentioned in sort of enthusiastic accounts of what different AI tools are doing at the moment, but it's, I think, very far from reality, is the promise of intelligent, flexible, and easily usable tools that will be used by workers in problem-solving, decision-making, technical work, and creative tasks, and in doing so will increase their capabilities, potentially their wages, and perhaps the quality of their work. That promise is real, and I think it's technically feasible, even if not just around the corner. But I will argue that there are also major roadblocks to the realization of this promise. Some of those roadblocks are technical, and I'll come to that, but they are even more predominantly economic and social. And my purpose today is to highlight what that promise is and why those roadblocks are a reality, which I hope will be a way to avoid the really unhelpful false dichotomy that exists in some of the current debates about AI. Either that it is just unadulterated good and we're all going to be like huge beneficiaries from it and we have nothing to worry about, or that AI is just a scary technology that's going to destroy us or just steal our data. Well, there is truth to some of those claims, but much more productive is to conceptualize what it is that AI can do and why we're actually not realizing those benefits. And I'll talk about why some of those are really about what corporate leaders are focusing on. Some of it is what the tech industry is focusing on, and it is about what goes on in the labor market and what goes on with what I will call control of information. But there are also some interesting issues which we haven't touched so much upon in the book, such as what I'm going to call human AI misalignment. Okay. Part of my argument is going to be that we are at the cusp of some very, very important, highly consequential choices, but that the choices that we have to make are not unprecedented. In fact, the same tensions have shaped the entire computer science and artificial intelligence project since the beginning of the field. And in fact, I think the field of AI and digital tools more generally has been pulled in two very different directions since the early 1950s. One of the emphasis in the book with Simon is that the vision, call it ideology, call it the aspirations of leaders, scientific leaders, business leaders, matter greatly. And in this instance, the visions of the tech entrepreneurs and scientists were very important. And these two visions have truly consequential effects on how we pursue AI and who benefits from it. One of those, again, I'm simplifying, of course, there's a lot of gray areas, but simplifying it, one is captured by the early brilliant work of the absolutely brilliant British mathematician Alan Turing, as well as the American mathematician Alonzo Church, that about how to conceptualize what machines do and what humans can do. And one of the major emphasis of Turing from the beginning was that there is a possibility and a desirability of building something you could call, what he called, autonomous machine intelligence. What that means is that we can make machines autonomous without human control, and intelligent, meaning that they're going to be able to perform a lot of complex tasks. The reason why this vision was so powerful is first because it was interesting and different. Second, because it easily lent itself to lots of Hollywood movies and nice novels, killer robots and all that. And third, it actually, as a corollary, came with a business strategy. If machines are autonomous and intelligent, then they can do what humans can do. So we can go ahead and automate a lot of tasks. This was not just Turing. Many of the luminaries of the field, including all these very famous gentlemen who were the ones who very optimistically thought in 1956 that they would be able to make huge progress on artificial intelligence in a couple of months in the Dartmouth project, where the field of AI, artificial intelligence, was christened, were among those. But a very different vision was there from the very beginning. And this was one in which machines were there as tools to complement human abilities. This was the emphasis of the MIT engineer mathematician Norbert Wiener, as well as some very important engineers and visionaries such as J.C.R. Licklider or Douglas Engelbart. And here, the emphasis was throughout on making machines more useful to humans. And that's why Simon Johnson and I call this perspective in the book machine usefulness rather than machine intelligence. And it was also very clear from the beginning that this could be only achieved if it was pro-human in the way of making it more usable, more useful to humans. Many of the things that we depend on today, we take it for granted, such as the majority of the key innovations that went into what is now your smartphone, or the computer mouse, or hypertext and hyperlinks. All of those actually came from this machine usefulness perspective. In fact, several of those key innovations were revealed in a demo that Douglas Engelbart had in the 1950s called the mother of all demos, where he revealed some of these prototypes of these technologies, such as, for example, how the computer mouse used to look like. And J.C.R. Licklider turned this into an overall research agenda for engineers, and he called it human-machine symbiosis. And what he means by that, I'll explain in a second. Now, a lot of that was aspiration as well as reality. Some of these important technologies easily spread, but digital tools until recently have not been up to the task of being really very useful tools in the hands of many workers. They could, of course, be useful for design workers or office workers in some ways, but the ability of doing so was limited. And the reason for that is because I think the key aspect that was missing in these technologies was a possibility to complement true human decision-making, problem-solving, or you might call knowledge work. Today, a lot of the things that we do in our offices, but not just in our offices, in factories, in other contexts, involve this degree of high-level problem-solving. If you're an electrician, you have to solve a series of problems. It's all human decisions. If you're a carpenter, you have to solve a level of decisions. If you're a designer, if you're a healthcare provider, if you're an educator. But we didn't really have a way of providing new expanded tasks and much better capabilities for these workers. I think the promise of generative AI is, in fact, doing this in a scale that was previously not possible. So in this way, I would like to think of the generative AI as an information retrieval, filtering, and curation tool. What I mean by that is that if you are an electrician and you are dealing with new problems, most of the knowledge that you need, most of the information that you need is actually out there. But that information abundance is completely useless because it's not turned into useful information. If bits and pieces of a new problem that you encounter, for example, in the electricity grid, is there on the internet, how are you going to find that? Even the existing search tools would require a lot of time and wouldn't actually turn those information into usable information. So the hope that one day generative AI, and it's definitely not today, I'm certainly not going to be convinced that ChatGPT could do that, despite all the hype. But one day it could do that. It could retrieve that information quickly. It could filtrate it, meaning it can recognize what are the relevant parts of that information for your problem, and curate it, meaning that it can present it to you in a usable way so that you can use that information in real time. And this is exactly what actually J.C.R. Licklider sort of foresaw 60 years ago. And he said, the hope is that in not too many years, human brains and computing machines will be coupled together very tightly. And that is, I think, the promise. J.C.R. Licklider was focusing much more on office work and creative work, but I think it's actually as true for blue-collar work. But the problem is whether it can actually turn into a reality. Well, first I'm going to say that in a very, very minor way, we already have some proof of concept that this can happen. This proof of concept should not be exaggerated, but there are a number of papers that have come out over the last 9 months or so, which show that in very small scale and selected settings, generative AI can be used for making workers that are not the best one at their job. They have some expertise, but not very high level of expertise. Improve their productivity, do things faster and more reliably. For example, this is shown in the context of programming using GitHub Copilot by Peng et al. For the writing tasks by our graduate students, Shaket Noe and Whitney Zhang, who show that lower productivity workers, if given access to ChatGPT, can improve their performance in very simple tasks. These figures are from their paper. They do a randomized control experiment. The green is the treatment group that uses the large language models, and the gray is the control group. And you see that the time to complete is shifted to the left, quality is shifted to the right. But if you look at the figure more clearly, you will see that the shift comes from the people who are performing less well. So it's the lower expertise workers who are being boosted. And this is similar work by Eric Brynjolfsson and co-authors in the context of customer service. But what I'm going to argue in the rest of the talk is that this reality, so this promise, is not likely to be reality. And it's not likely to be reality because there are 4 interrelated roadblocks on it. And each one of these is pushing us in a very different direction. And all of them have implications about the technical, architectural, or design nature of large language models, but they have, as John rightly anticipated, they are socially determined, meaning they are related about who makes the decisions and what their business models are like, etc. So let me talk first about automation. So this gets to the heart of it because, as I've pointed out, the first vision of autonomous machine intelligence really pushes us towards automation. And this is a big change or a big ask, but I think we need to really move away from this autonomous machine intelligence vision if you're going to be able to do it. And the problem is, as you can imagine, the entire tech sector in the United States is completely sold into this vision. But to make this point a little bit more specifically, I want to show you what automation has brought until now and why its continuation is A, likely, and B, potentially disastrous. So first, I want to just focus on the US labor market and show you that a lot of what I'm saying is motivated and informed by my studying of what happened to the US labor market, to US inequality, to US shared prosperity during the age of digital machines since around 1980. If you look at the US labor market before 1980, for example, 60s, early 70s, 50s, which I'm not showing you here, you see broadly equal and shared prosperity growth. In fact, for the 50s, inequality was actually declining. You can see that here by tracing the real wage growth, or everything normalized to zero, so you can trace out the real wage growth of different demographic groups. This is for men, this is for women. The red is for lowest education groups, high school dropouts, orange for high school graduates, dark blue is for workers with postgraduate degrees. So all of these curves are on top of each other, meaning that everybody is growing at the same time their earnings, and this is the sort of the shared prosperity that we sometimes aspire to and somehow perhaps foolishly hope that we're going to get back to. But look at the 1980s and you see a very different pattern. Postgraduate workers are enjoying very rapid growth in their earnings, but actually not just inequality increasing, but you see a very striking pattern of low education workers losing their earnings. So their real earnings are declining, which means that their nominal wages are not keeping up with inflation. My work over the years has made two important arguments which inform my thinking about AI in this context. One is that this isn't the only, one is that this is a lot about automation. It was the choices that we made about how to use digital technologies along with the autonomous machine intelligence vision, and concentrating and focusing on automation that is responsible for it. And two, that this wasn't the only path, that we could have used these technologies in a more pro-worker direction. We would never have achieved the kinds of information retrieval, filtration, curation promise that generative AI has, given the capabilities of the technology, but there was much more that we could have done to have a pro-worker direction for work. So here is one graph that tries to summarize why I think the automation aspect was very important. And what I'm showing here is the real wage growth for a little bit more detailed demographic groups, not just distinguished by gender and education, but gender, education, age, and ethnicity in the United States. Each one of these circles is a cell. And I'm focusing on their wage growth, cumulative wage growth during this critical periods starting from 1980 all the way to 2016, 2017. And you can see that many of these groups are below the 0 degree line, which means that cumulatively, since 1980, they have actually lost earnings in real terms. But the key here is the horizontal axis, which is our measure of how much task displacement these groups have been exposed to, in particular measured as what fraction of the tasks that they used to perform in 1980 have since been automated. And you see a very striking relationship. In fact, a lot of the between group inequality in the United States is accounted for this automation focus. And again, this wasn't the only thing we could have done. We could have created new tasks. We could have tried to make workers more productive with digital tools, but we didn't. And that's why we ended up here. And one little addition to that is that actually, if you look at the data, and I'm not going to have time to do that today, you'll also see that the productivity gains that were promised from digital technology didn't really realize. And that's what Pasquale Restrepo and I call socio-automation. If you're in the grips of this autonomous machine intelligence vision, you are so rushed in automating work that you end up automating a lot of things that humans are good at. So you're getting not much productivity benefits, but you're getting a lot of disastrous distributional consequences. This is not a new thing in history. And this is one of the main arguments of the book that I have with Simon, that we have seen the same kind of choices. And indeed, there are obvious reasons from the corporate side that also creates a bias towards automation. Employers, managers are sometimes just too focused for short-termist reasons or other reasons on cutting costs. They want to control labor, which was one of the main effects, one of the main objectives of the modern factory system, such as the power mills that I'm showing here in the textile industry. And we've seen this sort of inequality and low stagnant wage and harsh working condition consequences of these technologies in the Industrial Revolution as well. And the other thing that you learn from history is that there wasn't an automatic correction mechanism that said, oh, okay, things could be bad with automation, but at some point we're going to change things around and we're going to start improving workers' lot. There was nothing automatic about it. It actually did turn around in the second half of the 19th century, we point out, we document in the book, but it was not because of some automatic inexorable process, but because of the types of socially constructed choices that John hinted at the beginning. There was fundamental political reform, was a very difficult reform process. Labor organization, trade unions that were banned became allowed and started negotiating on technology, on working conditions, as well as wages. And there was a huge redirection of technology away from pure automation towards increasing worker productivity, creating new tasks for workers. Now, if you thought that with AI, we are in a new world, that's not true. We don't know for generative AI, but in earlier work with David Otter, Joe Hazel, and Pasquale Restrepo, we looked at the pre-generative AI, and what we found is exactly the same kind of things that we saw with previous digital technology waves. Automation focus, it went after routine and simple jobs in offices, and it led to less wage growth and less employment growth in the affected places. Better AI has to really focus on creating new tasks and new productivities for workers, which was, again, the same point of the information retrieval, filtration, and curation emphasis. But I would like to point out, again, there is much we can learn from history, because it wasn't the only revolutionary technology which could be used for creating new tasks. Actually, what I'm showing here is the Henry Ford's electrified early car factories. They were at the forefront of automation and introduction of advanced machinery, but they were also at the forefront of creating more complex, more better, more technical human decisions, as well as a range of new tasks. So therefore, the first roadblock is excessive automation. And the reason why this is a major roadblock is because it is the meeting of two powerful forces: corporate emphasis on automating work, cost-cutting, and control over labor, and the tech industry's emphasis on autonomous machine intelligence. There are other problems. Better decision-making requires diverse, heterogeneous information. And what we find in other instances of new information tools is that they are sometimes used in ways that actually create excessive homogeneity or loss of informational or behavioral diversity. This is a particular issue with generative AI because it leads to centralization of information and sometimes, to some extent, centralized control of information. Of course, people are talking about how open source can change all of this, but that needs to be tested. And we cannot learn from this from history, or we can learn from the printing press and other things. But I think better examples for this come from other digital technologies. For example, things like GPS, which were promised to lead to much better traffic, haven't done so. And part of the reason studies find is because they send everybody down to the same narrow paths and narrow roads and actually increase congestion rather than solving it. So it's just like the diversity that resulted from decentralized decision-making actually gets lost when these tools are not used properly. Now, this actually becomes really interesting in the context of large language models and generative AI, because there is an element of this informational diversity reduction that would emerge from the current business model of the tech firms would be AI digging its own grave. One recent study shows, for example, that the repositories which were the basis of the information that trained GPT-4, for example, all of the prowess that some of you may have seen from GPT-4 in programming comes from its learning from a platform called Stack Overflow, where humans post questions about programming and they get a lot of responses that are nicely curated, and then GPT-4, scraped all of that data or expropriated all of that data and trained itself and learned how to do these routines. But as soon as GPT-4 started giving programming advice, Stack Overflow essentially is killed. So the next generation of large language models are not going to have that type of data. So it's not just about AI going in the wrong direction, but there's an element of the AI being its own grave. Now, if you're going to use AI for providing information, the curation part is really important as well, meaning that you actually have to present the information in a way that can actually be understood and acted upon in the right way. And early examples of AI, I have two examples here, but let me not belabor them in the interest of time. One is from predictive policing. The other one by two of my colleagues is on the context of healthcare. They show plenty of misunderstanding or human AI misalignment. And this is not a fault of the humans per se, and it's not something that you're going to be able to fix easily, given that these AI models, again, for business reasons and a variety of, and I think partly ideological reasons, were developed as black box models, is going to make it very difficult for humans to understand what information is being represented and to what extent it's reliable. And as long as that continues, this AI human misalignment will be there, and it will be a major roadblock to these better decision-making by humans powered by generative AI. Finally, control of information is deeply political. So I'm not going to get too much into the issue of democracy. This is something we cover a lot in the book, but in the interest of time. But how you use information is always political. Information has played a major role in political control. Jeremy Bentham thought, in some sense, that the panopticon type things could be efficiency-enhancing tools, but that was an ideological blind spot on Jeremy Bentham. Panopticon was very early on understood, even though it wasn't developed, as a method of social control by people in the 19th century. And similar tools were developed across different number of countries. And the issue is that the control of information is very blatantly based a way of social control in China. And we sometimes kid ourselves that it's not in the West because it's in the hands of Facebook and Google, but it's no less a method of social control. And of course, if better information is curated, is collected, put to work, but the control remains in the hands of a few bosses or a few platforms, that's not going to turn into the reality of helping the workers, or even if you can turn it into a productivity enhancing tool, it's not clear that workers would get the benefit because the balance of political power would be so unequally tilted. So the last thing that I want to say here, and this is the slide that I had a little bit branching into some of the political issues, but let me skip that. Let me conclude without further ado so that I will leave enough time for Q&A. With all of these problems, I think the solution cannot be concocted without a major redirection of technology, redirection of AI. We need to make it more pro-worker, more pro-human, more information democratic. And that's not just a problem of, introducing a few regulatory policies and so on. We need regulation. We need all of these things to be embedded in the right social context, in the context of countervailing powers, as I and Simon talk about in our book, Power and Progress. But it goes even deeper. And part of the reason why it goes deeper is because the way that the tech industry has evolved and the way that they built these generative AI tools is a consequence of the particular vision and the particular balance of power that existed. And so we need a fairly large number of changes. And in the book, we talk about how the narrative needs to change, how we need new institutions that build new countervailing powers from the side of the regulatory power of the state, as well as civil society. And we also make a number of policy suggestions as preliminary ideas for the types of policies that could start shifting the dial in where the incentives are. So we can talk about some of these in the Q&A, but let me say that if the main question that we started with is the one still in your mind, is it possible to have pro-worker AI? The good news is, yes, it is possible. I think it is actually more possible with generative AI than perhaps with some earlier digital tools. The bad news is that that's definitely not where we're heading right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Acemoglu. That was very interesting and insightful. We can now turn to some questions that viewers have been posting in the Q&A box. I will take one here in particular that one of the viewers is interested in the cohort perspective of that wage growth chart that you showed. Isn't there a changing level of education by different cohorts that might explain some of the variation that you documented there?
So there are important cohort effects, but the chart that I'm showing is by education group. So the educational changes are going to impact how you take those curves and how do you aggregate them to get mean wage. So if you wanted to think about the mean wage, yes, the mean wage growth in the US has been slightly better than what that chart might imply because there are more college graduate workers and fewer high school dropouts. Actually, not that many fewer high school dropouts. The high school graduation rate has been very constant at 90%, but there are fewer high school graduates in the US. But there is a deeper sort of challenge here, which is, well, could it be that as we are leaving fewer high school graduates, there is a compositional change that the less unobservably skilled are the high school graduates? That doesn't seem to explain the data. There are a number of different ways of looking at that, and I have done that in some of my previous work, and that doesn't seem to explain the data. That's a valid thing to worry about, but it's not the explanation.
Okay, thank you. I think that makes sense. To me, it does. Hopefully, it responds to the questioner. Another question here from one of our viewers: what is your take on AI potentially leading to mass loss of jobs and mass unemployment? This is not supported by the evidence, right? It's more loss of quality of jobs than quantity of jobs.
100%. So a lot of the popular debate centers on AI creating mass unemployment or robots creating mass unemployment. So far, there is no evidence of mass unemployment aspect. I'll give you some caveats to that, but the big effects of the previous rounds of automation digital technologies, such as advanced machinery like automated conveyor belts, automated drilling and welding machines, robots, specialized software systems in offices, have all been to destroy good jobs and replace them with lower quality jobs, and as a result on inequality. So a much bigger effect on inequality than on jobs. And that makes a lot of sense in the US context because US has a weak social safety net. So if you're a blue-collar worker and you lose your welder job that used to pay, in today's wages, $50 an hour, you're going to go and try to get a $15 an hour or $20 an hour construction job. Many of the blue-collar workers would do that. So that's the part of the reason why we don't see such huge employment effects. Caveat, it's not like there is zero employment effects. So in a number of different works that I have done, first, you find that demographic groups that have been more impacted by automation also have lost some jobs, meaning their employment population ratio is a bit lower. Not a huge, but it is there. And moreover, you see that in the local labor markets. Like, for example, local labor markets where you've seen most impact from robot adoption, for example, have significantly higher non-employment rates. But if you look at the quantitative magnitudes, this is not taking us anywhere to mass unemployment. Now, with generative AI, there is huge amount of hype. So I do not think that any one of the more aggressive scenarios of how generative AI is going to spread in the labor market are valid. But it will spread, and as it spreads, it will create some joblessness. But I think, again, in the United States, the big effect will be on inequality and the quality of jobs, like your question implies.
Okay. Another question. Automation contributed to wage inequality, but didn't policies play a role as well? At the very least, governments allowed it to happen. Privatization and deregulation allowed the wealthy to create institutional structures that allowed them to enrich themselves. If you agree that this is the case, is giving workers more power and strengthening the role of the state sufficient? What else is needed to promote deep institutional changes?
Wow, that's a fantastic question. Unfortunately, I don't have 3 hours to answer it, which would have been a minimum amount of time to. But first of all, you are 100% right. Institutional changes have played a major role. So in the book, Simon and I emphasize that for shared prosperity, you need wage growth, and for wage growth, you need two conditions. One is that technology doesn't just go down the automation path, that there is other things that increase workers' productivity. And second, workers have voice and power so that they actually share in some of the gains that are made. And in the United States, at the same time, we have dismantled unions and regulations and accelerated automation. So the institutional changes have played a direct role in the declines in the real wages of low-wage, low-education workers. But even worse, I think the automation choices were embedded in a social context in which workers did not have voice. So if you go down the path of excessive automation in a workplace and you're going to lay off workers or take away their good jobs and give them cleaning jobs, unions, if they have power, would object to that, and they will try to find different ways. And especially well-managed unions have done that, sometimes in the US, quite rarely, unfortunately, and a lot of times in Europe and in other contexts. So therefore, your question is absolutely on target. In the future, if we're going to create anything resembling shared prosperity, we need a different direction of technology, and we need a different set of institutions for representing worker and worker voice. But, a very, very important but, that's not an easy thing. And I don't just mean that building new labor organizations, something from a point of weakness, is difficult, but it really requires a different mindset on the part of labor organizations. And to illustrate that, I'm giving this a little bit longer than usual answer because I think it's a very important point, an important issue. So if you have an environment like the one in the United States, where the tech sector is going full speed down the automation path, and employers are very accountable to shareholders. The shareholder value revolution, which we discuss a lot in the book, has played an important ideological and practical role in the corporate strategies. And then you suddenly make one of these companies have a strong union, and that union asks for higher wages, say 40% wage raise. What will that manager do? I think the most obvious thing the manager will say, well, this is all the more reason to automate even more. So it doesn't actually get you out of the automation trap. It actually makes you even more trapped there. So the solution then has to be much more multifaceted. We need to have other tools so that managers have a way of increasing productivity with not just automation, but doing other things. And second, unions need to be really much better trained. Leadership needs to be much more cognizant of these issues. So their negotiation has to be not just on wages, but it has to be together with wages and how you use technology. So we're seeing some of the first glimpse of that in the WGA, where WGA didn't just ask for higher wages. They said, well, we want to have some rider control over AI and streaming. So negotiations have to be done jointly in the context of technology and wages. And unfortunately most of the union leadership in the United States is far, 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 far behind where they need to be. These issues are not central. UAW, for example, has a new inspiring president, and they are doing a very important campaign, but their approach to new technology is just say no, we don't want electric cars. That's not going to cut it. So labor movement has to articulate a way in which technology can be used in a more pro-worker direction. And I think unless the labor movement actually wakes up to that reality, it's not going to be effective.
Those are very interesting points. We have another question here. So if we suppose that the process of mainstreaming AI into productive systems catches on first in developed countries, what can you say of convergence effects? Poorer countries catching up to rich countries' GDP per capita levels, for example, and about related power relations between countries.
Fantastic questions, because that last one is a separate question. And let me actually not answer that last part, which is the power relations. Very interesting. I've thought some about it, but let me answer the first part because I think it's very important. And it would be hugely, Western centric if we just focused on the developed world. In the book, our main emphasis is what goes on in the United States, Europe, and China, because that's where the technology frontier is. But we also emphasize that these things have first-order consequences for the developing world. It is undoubtedly true that these technologies are going to spread in the developing world. There already are. ChatGPT is used by hundreds of millions of people around the world. Businesses are going to use. They're behind, but so are in the United States. In the United States right now, only 1.5% of all businesses have made any investments in AI. So it's going to come in the US. It's going to come in the developing world. But even more deeply, even if the developing emerging world, countries like Indonesia, India, Turkey, Brazil, did not invest in AI, they would be hugely affected by it because the global division of labor would change. And when you look at the question of will the developing world be harmed or benefit from AI technologies, it turns on a very similar set of principles to the ones that I talked about, workers. And there's a very good reason for that. Many of these countries are abundant in middle skill labor, and fairly simple production tasks is where their comparative advantages lie. So we are not in the 1950s anymore, but the sort of growth model that's Taiwan, South Korea, other East Asian countries, and then China pursued is still sort of not so different from what many successful emerging countries are pursuing. They're using their human resources and the fact that labor is cheap relative to the West to start a export-led or offshoring-led production process. That can be helped if new AI tools help these workers. If you help middle skill workers, like I talked about helping customer service reps or electricians, that would be true for those in India or Indonesia as well. And in addition, these tools are going to be great for workers for who English is not a native language, so they can provide services globally much more effectively. But on the other hand, if we go down the current automation path, it means that the jobs that are going to be automated are going to be cutting not just into the livelihood of American workers, but also Indonesian or Mexican or Indian workers as well. So my fear is that if AI goes down the current automation path rather than the more promising human complementary path, it would also increase inequality between rich and poor countries.
All right. Another question here is, do you view the challenges to pro-human AI in the long run as being more political or more technological in nature?
Great question. They are both, but more importantly, I would say the technological challenges are politically and socially embedded. Let me try to give you an example from ChatGPT to illustrate that. So ChatGPT, I've talked about information retrieval, filtration, and curation. And of course, reliable information is key for that. And today, I think, except the biggest boosters of the industry admit that what you get from GPT-4 is quite unreliable. Hallucinations are the tip of the iceberg. So that's a technical problem, right? Well, I'm not sure. Actually, it is as much a social and economic problem. First of all, take the tip of the iceberg, hallucinations. Actually, hallucinations is not that hard to solve. people have known how to solve hallucinations very easily. Hallucinations is making up facts. So if you add one more layer to these programs, which is quite feasible, so that for the actual facts, they go and get verification from the internet, that problem would have been solved a year ago. Why haven't they done it? Because it's not a business priority. But if you dig a bit deeper, you'll see where the hallucination actually comes from. Hallucination comes from the fact that the design of these models was made in a very specific way. So one question that people ask is like, why is it that Reddit data is so crucial for these models? You know, like there isn't really that much information on Reddit. You know, if you're a scientist, say a doctor, you want to find out about some side effects of a drug, you wouldn't go to Reddit. So why are they training these models on Reddit? Are they just silly? No, they're not. The reason why they're training these models on Reddit, it's got nothing to do with information. The reason they're training them on Reddit is because they want these models sound human. And given the technology that you have available, the way that you sound human when predicting the next word is you need to have a huge corpus of what humans would say in similar directions. But why would you want these models to sound humans? I mean, you know, if your purpose was to get better information from these models, why would you want them to sound human? That just doesn't make sense. But if your purpose is to create hype, and also you are at the grips of this, you know, artificial machine intelligence dream, then you want to make them sound human. But as a social and economic decision, you want to create hype and you have a particular ideological hang-up. So it is that social and economic decisions that have pushed the industry in this very strange direction. But it's going to be very difficult to make these things sound human or be like that. So then you build a bigger and bigger and bigger and more black box machines. Now, black boxness, the lack of transparency, lack of explainability becomes a challenge. But again, that's not a technical challenge. It is a technical challenge, but it's not a purely technical challenge. It's a consequence of your distorted business model. So that's why we have to solve both of those problems at the same time.
Very good. So concerning policy incentives, can you mention some of the policy incentives that could support a change to move away from only automation? Would those incentives be mostly fiscal? And what kind of ethical regulations or framework should be in place?
Fantastic question. So first of all, the fiscal ones are the easiest. And the one that we focus on in the book is not an automation tax or a robot tax, because before doing that, we could actually do something even simpler, remove the already existing asymmetries that exist in pretty much every industrialized nation tax code, which subsidizes machines and taxes labor. So if you hire labor to perform some tasks, you pay a lot of tax. If you hire machines, you get subsidies. So that creates an artificial boost to automation. There's also reason to believe that innovation is insufficiently going in the human complementary pro-worker direction. So we may need some subsidies in the same way that we still need big subsidies to renewables. And those were very important in the early stages over the last 12 years or so in giving a big boost to offshore, onshore wind and photovoltaic cells and other solar panel technologies. So we would need a program, and I think there are ways of designing such programs so that they are more efficient. They will help. But you are absolutely right in the last part of your question. Those are not completely sufficient because, as I've pointed out, you do have part of the problem being rooted in the visions and ideology of the tech sector. So we need to start changing that as well. So talking about these issues, changing the narrative is a very important part of the problem. You know, I have talked to a lot of people from the tech industry, and the very, very top people are completely blind to these issues. But if you go to the next layers, there are a lot of people who are socially concerned, but they don't have the tools and they don't have the ecosystem to create the right set of social responsibility. And that's never going to emerge without institutions. So we first need laws and regulations and institutions. And it is in that context that norms need to change. But the changes in norms are really important. You know, the sort of the prevailing view in the tech industry, and this starts being drilled into people as, high school students or first-year undergraduates. If you are a computer scientist or if you're an AI specialist, you're a disruptor. You go and disrupt everything, and that's your job, and you don't have to worry about anything else. And that sort of mindset, of course, is a disaster, because these technologies that you prepare are potentially very, very consequential in terms of their implications, and they're going to have very different, very broad implications. So to say that, my role is just as a disruptor and I don't have any social responsibility is actually, I think, is sillier than to say, guns don't kill people, people kill people. I mean, I think this is even more, some of these technologies are even more loaded than guns. So you cannot say, okay, I'm going to create technologies for promoting misinformation, but that's fine. That's just a disruptive technology. I think that wouldn't cut. So then how do we develop the right ecosystem where people, become more ethical in their choices of how to develop technologies as well as how to use technologies? I think those are some of the key questions.
It seems that as different fields develop, the need for some ethical oversight and some ethical principles develops, and so in some ways we're seeing this whole sector developing, and hopefully it will also take on that additional task of the
absolutely rest. And as I said, there's a lot of demand from within the sector as well.
So maybe we can have one more question quickly. How would you explain the negative effect of technological progress on wages in lower educational cohorts? Why is it less severe for women than for men? Do you think this will be different with AI, meaning will generative AI disproportionately affect women negatively?
Excellent. So, my explanation for the low performance of low education groups is exactly what I said earlier, which is it's automation plus institutions. The fact that there are no minimum wages or unions or social norms, that's been very important. And when you look at automation, there are two reasons why women have been, at least in that figure, less affected by automation. One is that there was a general process of catching up of women. So that's why average wages are increasing more for women than men. So that's sort of creating the impression that, women, low education groups have been less impacted. So that's partly true, but partly a bit of that convergence phenomenon. But also more importantly, exactly like you anticipated, if you look at our data on how much different demographic groups have been automated, women have been impacted less than men. And the reason for that, women are in office jobs, but they are not overrepresented in the automated office jobs, and they're not in the blue-collar jobs that like welders and painters and assembly workers. So that's why the burden fell more on men. And this is a contributing factor, not the main factor in the convergence and the disappearance or the weakening of the gender premium. But with AI, that may change. It's going to really depend on which are the sectors that are going to adopt AI most rapidly. Some of the sectors that are adopting AI more rapidly, like ads, simple writing tasks, and IT security, are not super gender imbalanced, but others may end up being so.
Well, with that, I think we can bring this to a close. This has been very interesting, Professor, and I think the audience also appreciates very much that you've taken some time to be here with us today and to share your insights on this very interesting and timely topic.
Thank you very much for having me, John. Thank you, Marta and Maren, for the invitation, and I'm very happy to have been part of this conversation.
Thanks so much, Aaron. This was great. There's a lot of applause. If you can see it on the side.
Thank you. Thank you.
We can applaud like this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Thank you.